You just assaulted an officer of the law!
When South Park: The Stick of Truth came out in 2014, I thought it was an excellent adaptation of the show. From visual style to the game's writing, it embodied virtually everything South Park was at the time. Certainly, it's a tough act to follow for its sequel, aptly named South Park: The Fractured But Whole. And with that title, you'll likely get a clear picture of whether or not the game's humor even appeals to you at all. Important, as either way it is the main driving force of the game. Ultimately, The Fractured But Whole took me about 14 to 15 hours to rather thoroughly complete on the maximum difficulty settings. And finally, this review won't contain any significant spoilers beyond the first few hours.
Greetings, citizen. It is I, Super Craig.
To get right to the main element of the title, The Fractured But Whole is without a doubt yet another solid adaptation of the South Park show. Fans of the show will likely enjoy the game, and those that have never been interested in its comedic style in the first place certainly won't change their mind here. It's a game that, quite literally, is built around fart jokes. In it, you yet again play as the New Kid, an entirely mute character whose gender, race, religion, and even socioeconomic situation is entirely up to you. This blank state works well, as it gives you far more freedom than if the game would have had put you in the shoes of, say, the loudmouthed Cartman or ever-righteous Kyle, characters you will certainly be interacting with a lot. Although it does follow the events of The Stick of Truth and will reference this former story from time to time, it is largely self-contained. In The Fractured But Whole, you take up the role of a superhero, part of one of two rivaling superhero franchises entirely made up by the kids of South Park, and this choice of theme plays very well into some of the show's core strengths, while yet again giving you a sense of freedom in who you choose to be. Starting with the seemingly simple task of tracking down a stray cat, you will soon find yourself combating an incredible range of enemies such as ninjas, sixth graders, Italian mobsters, or even more arcane types. The superhero suit of the plot then allows for a lot of creativity, and exploring every story avenue is incredibly entertaining. Because most characters that you will interact with are fellow or rival superheroes, this allows The Fractured But Whole to present a lot of the children's issues in an ever-amusing and increasingly absurd way. For instance, Stan, or Toolshed, as his superhero persona has become, will explain his tragic backstory while making it clear he still struggles with his father's alcoholism. And no matter how absurd these stories end up being, The Fractured But Whole does an excellent job at keeping these consistently relevant. Virtually everything thrown at you isn't just there for a quick throwaway laugh, but gets referenced and pulled back further on into the plot. For a title that otherwise is built on literal toilet humor, the creative spark that the superhero theme allows carries the story in a major way, as you'll scour every corner of South Park in order to fill in your entire superhero sheet. When looking at other elements of the comedic South Park style, The Fractured But Whole does end up falling short when it comes purely to the often used current affair humor that is incredibly prevalent in the last few South Park seasons especially. Essentially, it is a byproduct of the game's development time, and if that's the main element you find entertaining when it comes to South Park humor, that might be a small letdown, certainly. Mainly, if you are open to the extreme absurdism that South Park allows, you'll find that The Fractured But Whole does an excellent job at keeping you entertained from its surreal and terribly crude angles. And luckily, this isn't just limited to dialogue or cinematic content. No, in fact, most of its hilarious moments are found in the combat gameplay, as you'll find yourself facing off against the most ridiculous types of enemies possible, with the constant entertaining chatter from your fellow superheroes in the background. And to be clear, I'm purposely not showing most of these, as what I probably enjoyed most of all was simply being surprised at what deranged moments I ran into next. When it comes to gameplay, the way The Fractured But Whole plays out is rather simple. You move around South Park in typical 2.5D style, and every now and then you'll run into a group of enemies, sixth graders for instance, which are blocking your path or try to get the jump on you. If you hit them before they hit you, you get an initiative bonus, but either way the game then jumps into a grid-based map in which you can slightly move around depending on the specific location the fight happens to be on. Fights that take place during story missions are outlined very specifically and happen in an entirely structured manner. Combat itself is between you and 3 possible allies, out of 12 total companions which become available or unavailable as you progress throughout the story. During combat, each character has 4 different abilities, of which one is an ultimate ability that is activated through a shared ultimate gauge. Additionally, you also have access to a limited number of consumables, most of which are meant to heal, of which some are more dramatic than others, such as a Macaroni Star of David to summon Moses to heal you in battle. Looking purely at the combat mechanics itself, The Fractured But Whole makes a core upgrade in regards to the Stick of Truth, by adding some complexity through movement and abilities with limited range. Without a doubt, your main challenge in combat then comes from pairing the right companions with your own ability loadout. Theirs can't be changed, whereas you have freeform access to up to 10 different classes, which each have 3 different abilities and an ultimate. In addition to planning ahead so that you won't end up being unable to use certain characters during certain turns because of movement or range constraints. But even though the core of the combat has been improved, the systems that try to back it up behind the scenes are unfortunately lacking, resulting in a rather simplistic experience in general, and even on the maximum difficulty, besides certain bosses, I found actual challenge very hard to find.
Where are you going, my lord? That's World's End!
Even though 10 classes sounds like a wide range to choose from, the fact of the matter is that you are incredibly constrained by your small limit of abilities, and there aren't enough interesting consumables to make up for this either. In the end, you can combine 4 classes at once, and you can change any class by talking to cardmen outside of missions. So, as a speedster, brutalist, cyborg, and martial artist superhero, I technically had access to 12 core abilities, but as you can never select more than 3 at a time, I found it very difficult to make any exciting combinations, and as class combinations don't inherently change anything, having such a wide range of classes felt rather meaningless. Each ability is further based on an attribute score such as brawn or brains, which are increased through an artifact system, the only level reward system in the game. But sadly, these artifacts aren't very exciting as they are almost always simple damage increases which you need in order to progress throughout the storyline. Beyond that, there's nothing to really consider as you progress, making the experience of leveling up almost irrelevant rather than rewarding. Unlocking more classes is exciting, and they are gradually spoon-fed to you as you continue throughout the main story, but ultimately the Fractured But Whole fails to utilize this range of classes in any meaningful way. However, that is not to say that the combat is boring. Combat, like the entirety of the game, is carried by its absurd humor. Although the pacing of the game is initially slow, you'll find that in most combat situations it's simply delightful to see what kind of crazy abilities and maneuvers your enemies end up doing. Boss fights are potential situations where combat starts to heat up a little, as the game breaks its own rules by introducing boss-specific abilities that ignore turns and count down every second regardless of what is going on, forcing you to move at a much faster pace than you might be comfortable with. In the end, fights are simple but very creatively structured and remain entertaining throughout. Outside of combat, you will also run into what the game refers to as puzzles, although I'd personally hesitate to call them such. For instance, you'll notice item chests on top of rooftops, or paths blocked by certain objects. Once you've unlocked the appropriate companion or fart-based story skill, you will have the option to traverse these, and certainly they are amusing at first. Sadly, figuring out how these work is something you'll have nailed down within the first few hours, and thus it becomes more of a bother when they fill mission levels with these as you progress. Repetitive and simple, rather than interesting puzzle elements, unfortunately. It will come as no surprise that the South Park game requires a love for South Park's humor. If you're not a frequent watcher of the show yet do appreciate the absurd comedy, you'll be entertained with the Fractured But Whole without doubt. If you do watch the show, you'll find it's a great adaptation that contains plenty of references to older episodes as well. Yes, unfortunately the combat is very simplistic, and I wish the game would have allowed for more depth in its character and class building, would have offered more challenge in both combat and puzzle elements, but regardless, it is beautifully carried by the South Park atmosphere, visual style, and excellent over-the-top soundtrack pairing all of these disturbing cinematics and combat moments. With this review, you can be certain that I've left most of the entertaining elements for you to find. As I don't want to spoil anything specific, let's just say that the further you go into this story, the further it goes away from sanity. With the Fractured But Whole, they have definitely outdone themselves when it comes to original boss designs. Thank you for watching, my name has been Haas, and I'll see you in the next video.